Well, good morning, WellHouse Church. Pastor Cullen here, excited to be back with you for another week of storytelling through the book of Acts. And this is an interesting one because in order for me to tell you this story, I have to tell you a little bit about my story. So I grew up in Southern Baptist traditions and churches that were related to that tradition. And I really thought there was one way to be a Christian. Like it could not have been a more exclusive faith. It was so exclusive that I even remember hearing people, church leaders, say things like, well, I think there will be some Catholics in heaven, as if their theology is so wrong that only a small percentage of them got it close enough to right that they will experience eternal fellowship with the divine. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. The Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the long-standing tradition of the Roman Catholic Church is the single longest-standing tradition of the church. It is the church historically. It's absolutely a part of the church. But yet, the faith that I was given was so exclusive that only those that thought like us or closely related to us enough were going to be correct, right, and they would experience salvation. Well, this came to a head for me in a class on the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation, if you don't know, is the last book in the Bible, and it is apocalyptic literature, it's prophetic, it's borderline impossible to interpret. There's hundreds of interpretations of that book. But I was taught that there was only one way to interpret that book. And so I walked into a class on the book of Revelation at Houston Baptist University as a junior. I must have been 20 years old, something like that. And the professor of the class was named Joe Blair. And he walked in, there's maybe 20 people in this class. And he walked in and introduced himself. Hi, I'm Dr. Blair, and this is Revelation. And I have a question to start. How many of you believe in a rapture? Now, the rapture of the church is the belief that when Jesus returns to begin the culminating act of reuniting heaven and earth together, that he's going to come down and all of the believers will be raptured. They'll be captured. They'll be taken up to heaven where God will allow hell, or literally the earth, to go to hell in a handbasket for some time of tribulation. It's a very interesting belief. But I was taught to believe that that was on the same level as the resurrection of Jesus. And so when Dr. Blair asked this question, my hand shot up. There was no question that I was letting this professor at this new school that I just started at for real theology classes think that I wasn't a real Christian. I never broke eye contact with him. I looked at him and I raised my hand, very proud. And he looked around the room and finally he looked at me. And when he looked at me, I got the sense that there was something odd happening. I was sitting on the front row of the class. So when he looked at me, I turned to look at the rest of the class. Church, I was the only person in the room with my hand raised. This is a theology class on the book of Revelation. I was the only person in the room with my hand raised. And it was in that moment that I realized that I couldn't continue to believe that I was the only one that had the right answer to questions of faith. That there had to be multiple answers because there had to be multiple contexts in which God interacted with faithful people. And so just because I lived in BFE and got one experience of faith handed to me doesn't mean that those who lived in urban settings and had a different experience of faith handed to them didn't have truths for me to glean from their realization of the faith that they had in their own unique contexts. But the way in which I had to bridge that gap was I had to listen to their contexts. You see, that's our story this morning. Throughout the history of the church, throughout the patristic period, the first 500 years into the Common Era, you have lots of schools of thought or schools of theology. But there are two main ones. The School of Alexandria, which is a very mystic and creative, poetic, allegorical school of spirituality. Then you had the Antiochian school, which is a very literal, lot of like Southern Baptist and expositional and exegetical preaching get their draw from this school. Well, we first get introduced into the church at Antioch, the Antiochian school, at the end of chapter 11. And it's really interesting how these people came to be. This is what the text says. Now those who were scattered because of the persecution that took place over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch. And they spoke the word to no one except Jews. So if you remember back earlier in chapter 7, 8, and 9, we begin to see this massive persecution of the church. And chapter 9 comes to the culmination where we get this conversion of Saul, the lead persecutor of the church. But in chapter 8, in the first martyr, Stephen, in his stoning, commissioned by Saul, you have Jews that scatter. Now, apparently, they are Jews that believe in the message of Jesus and have scattered. They've left Jerusalem for fear of persecution. And so what does that mean? It means that we're now in chapter 11, and they haven't had the privilege of hearing the message of 9, 10, and the first part of 11, where God begins to break down these ethnic barriers. That this message is no longer just for the Jews. They do not have this truth because they left. But some people come, some people from Cyprus, some men, and they begin to spread the message to the Hellenists, the Greeks, those who are not Jewish. And Jerusalem, the church at Jerusalem, begins to get word of this. And so they send a guy named Barnabas. And Barnabas shows up, and this is what he says. Text says, beginning in verse 22, news of this came to the ears of the church in Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to Antioch. When he came and saw the grace of God, he rejoiced. When he came and saw the grace of God. Church, if I can be very blunt and candid here, I think oftentimes when we experience other people of faith, we're not looking for the grace of God. We're looking for how to fix them so that their grace looks like our grace. That's not the way to do this, friends. That's not the message of Jesus. The message of Jesus is that Jesus is the judge. It's not our job to tell people how to express their faith. Our job is to faithfully, best that we can, love God and love our neighbor. Well, the truth is that I personally think the best thing that we can do to love God and love our neighbor is to listen. Listen to the voice of God and what God is instructing us to do. And listen to the voice of our neighbor in the way that they are making up that God is asking them to faithfully live out their divine likeness. Church, to love your neighbor is to listen to your neighbor in the way in which God might be in and around their context that's different than our own context. Listening to our neighbor may, in fact, bring us closer to divine ourselves. So, church, my question to you today: what are some things that you've heard others say that maybe we need to consider bringing into our faith context? But more importantly, what are some ways that you need to challenge yourself to better listen to your